Don't say anything too private. Thank you all for coming to Mormons Building Bridges Sunday School. I am really excited to be doing this, to have this opportunity to meet with people who I actually only know through Facebook. So thank you all for being here today. Thank you especially to James Jones and Derek Knox for being our teachers today. I appreciate the emotional labor that it is to teach. I know that you two are out there all the time trying to educate people, and I really appreciate that. This is recorded. We're going to post it publicly, so you can change your avatar so that you can't see it, or feel free to keep yourselves muted if you're not comfortable. Except you, James and Derek, you absolutely cannot mute yourself. If you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat. You should be able to see over there on the right-hand side of the screen usually to chat to everybody. Feel free to type that in there. Derek and James will address questions at the end. That way they can keep their momentum with the lesson. So far, James and Derek have 55 episodes of Beyond the Block across all major podcast platforms. So Apple, Spotify, all of them, right? They're fantastic. They range from deeply spiritual to really, really funny moments. This is where I'm going to say I really miss prayer roll, just for me personally. Also, a different take on the scriptures, right? A deep dive into the history of it, but also what does it mean to be a queer person in the LDS faith or a Black person in the LDS faith? Because sometimes those can be a little challenging. Brother Jones, I'm going to read from their bio here. Brother Jones and Brother Knox describe themselves as staunch advocates for the theology and harsh critics of the culture when it comes to Mormonism. A Black lifelong member and queer convert respectively, they bring a less heard perspective to the notoriously white and heteronormative faith. They feel their inner thrust for justice, love, and salvation for all people, regardless of color, sex, orientation, and other identities, is not only consistent with the message of Christ, but is the message of Christ. In that spirit, they share their thoughtful, honest, and occasionally raw and humorous take on Mormonism in an effort to shift the culture of Mormonism more into alignment with the theology of Mormonism. For my part, connecting with Beyond the Block was a way for me to stay connected to Mormonism at a time when the faith wasn't really working for me anymore. I am deeply grateful for that. And before I start getting all emotional, we're going to have an opening prayer by Tim Strong, and then we're just going to turn the time over to Derek and James.
All right, thanks. Father in heaven, we're grateful to have this forum and that we can share Sunday school together during this pandemic. We pray that will bless all who are affected by it, particularly bless our healthcare workers, that they'll feel thy strength and love. We're grateful for James and Derek, and they're willing to share a message with us today. Bless us that we'll have big open hearts to be able to learn and grow and share today, and to learn of the life of Ruth, and to learn more about what it means to be a disciple of the Savior. And we offer this prayer in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
Amen. All right, James and Derek, you're up.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Derek, do you have anything you want to put out there before I go ahead and give an introduction of our material today?
No, other than they forgot to say that I was the funny one. I'm just saying.
He kind of right about that. He is the funny one. I am not the jokes guy. I sometimes have jokes, but never intentionally, never deliberately. So there's that. Anyway, so yeah, we're gonna be talking about the Book of Ruth. Let me share my screen real quick so y'all don't gotta look at my face that hasn't been groomed in about 8 weeks. See if I can figure this out real quick. Yes, the Book of Ruth. So just by way of introduction, there is a lot going on in this in these 4 short chapters of Ruth. Several different kinds of narratives happening here. Ultimately, this is a story of redemption, at least the way I've read it, what I understand from the climax and the resolution of the Book of Ruth. It seems to me to be a story of redemption. It's also about unconventionality. There is very little in this story that is conventional at all. This is a story centering a poor Moabite woman who immigrates to an enemy country and embraces their culture by her mother-in-law, with whom she has a very loving relationship, so much so that she forsakes her own family, her own people, her own gods to be with her. She proposes to a much older man. Women name her child, and she becomes an ancestor of literal kings, including the Messiah. There might not be anything conventional about this whole story, except for the fact that Ruth is operating within systems that discourage just about everything she did in this story, in the name of the next theme, which is compassion. It seems to be the motivator behind just about everything Ruth does. It seems to be a recurring theme and attribute throughout the whole Book of Ruth as we read. So as we read, just be looking for these themes as well as affirming them, because especially when it comes to unconventionality, I think communities on the margins can really appreciate a biblical narrative or any kind of scriptural narrative that talks about unconventional people finding God, finding salvation in unconventional things, in unconventional ways, and in otherwise just non-prescribed unconventional things. Derek, did I miss anything in that introduction before we move on to the background?
No, other than I can tell a joke really quickly. What kind of man was Boaz before he got married?
No, don't do it. Don't do it.
He was ruthless.
Oh, that is not where I thought that was going. Well done. So, okay, so nothing else in the introduction before we move on to the background, because I don't have anything else there.
Yeah, no, let me just say a few things that I noticed. Thank you so much for that, James. That was really great. I love those themes. One of the things that I noticed, and this gets to the unconventionality, is that in Ruth, we see God working in the simple, the ordinary, and the everyday. We don't have large miracles. We don't have grand divine intervention. We don't even have God's in the text. By the way, anyone who's not me or James, I would just like you to mute yourself, just to keep this flowing a little bit better. So yeah, so God is never mentioned by the characters, never even mentioned by the narrator, with one exception, when the Lord helps Ruth conceive in chapter 4. Spoiler alert, Ruth and Boaz have a kid. And that's kind of the resolution of the story. Another thing is that God really works through commandments and through the righteous character of Ruth and Boaz. Not directly, but through these other people. And also Ruth is one of the 2 great love stories in the Bible, along with the Song of Songs. It's also one of the best crafted short stories in the Bible. So I hope each of you will be able to sit down and read it slowly at some point later. Another thing we should notice is the U-shaped comedy. The U-shaped comedy structure found in Ruth. You've got a descent into tragedy and drama, and then you've got an uplifting resolution. And it's very similar to Shakespeare, because in Shakespeare you've got a lot of confusion, misunderstanding, people in disguises, and it usually tragedies don't get resolved in the end in a happy way. Everyone dies, but in a comedy you usually have a good marriage, everyone's happy, and everyone lives happily ever after. And it's almost like a fairy tale. So that's all I have. James, is there, and then I'll get into sort of the legal background. Are we ready for that, James?
We are.
Okay. So there's some legal material in the Torah that forms this creative matrix for the telling of the story. And so much of the story relates to the interplay between the legal materials, which are a little bit ambiguous and open to interpretation, or at least they're open to seeing how they apply to different situations. And then you've got the character of the people.
Okay.
Okay.
So are you ready?
Oh, I hear someone in the background. Oh, well. Could we have one of the moderators mute everyone other than me and James? I don't know if that's possible. Okay. So the first thing to do is talk about the exclusion of the Moabites. There is a provision in Deuteronomy chapter 23 that says no Ammonite or Moabite may enter the assembly of the Lord. This prohibits intermingling and intermarriage. So that's the first thing to keep in mind, because Elimelech and his family go to Moab. They take the sons take Moabite wives, and then later Boaz marries a Moabite woman. So we have to keep that in mind, that this is transgressive right here. The second thing to keep in mind is the phenomenon of levirate marriage. This is in Deuteronomy chapter 25. What happens is, if one brother dies and leaves a widow, it was required for the dead brother's living brothers to marry the widow, so that his name, the dead man's name, would not be lost, that his lineage would be preserved, and his property and family line would be preserved. And so that's the background for that. There's another provision in Leviticus 25 about the kinsman redeemer. The word in Hebrew is goel. And that means that a close relative has the right and obligation to redeem someone from poverty. If their land has been sold out from under them, then they can buy it back. If someone is sold into slavery, then they can be redeemed by a near relative. And then another text we have is in Deuteronomy. There's many of these texts, but what I'm going to check out is Deuteronomy chapter 24. And this is the gleaning text. And here's what it says. Whenever you reap your harvest in your field and leave some unraked grain there, you must not return to get it. It should go to the resident foreigner. The Hebrew word there is ger, which really means someone from another country living in your country. It should go to the resident foreigner, the orphan, and the widow, so that the Lord your God may bless all the work that you do. And Ruth turns out to be in several of those categories. She is a sojourner from Moab in the land of Judah, and she's also a widow. Let's get back to some of the problems for women in the ancient Near East. Most, unfortunately, due to the patriarchy, women had value either as an unmarried virgin in their father's household or as a child-producing wife in their husband's household. And so if you didn't fall into one of those two categories, you were in a very socially and economically precarious situation, especially for widows. If there wasn't a man there to have economic and physical protection and legal protection as well, then you could run into all sorts of problems, which is why Naomi and Ruth had such a challenge as a widow. So now let's get into here James's commentary on the beginning of the text.
Yes, thank you, Derek. So what I got here is harkening back to what Derek said about, I did not do this right. Let me try this again. What Derek said about the tragedy. What we're going to move into is the first narrative of the Book of Ruth, which is a tragedy and an immigration. So what we have here is in the opening chapter, we learn of Elimelech and his wife Naomi, their two sons. Bethlehem is experiencing political turmoil as well as a famine. So they decide to go to Moab to pursue a better life and find some food. There's a couple things worth noting here. First is that Moab and Bethlehem don't really like each other all that much, and they haven't in all of their existence. And this speaks to how bad the situation was in Bethlehem, that Naomi's family went to their nation's enemy for aid. which we can almost see a direct analog to in our own country. It also speaks to how, I suppose, how devout Naomi's family may have been at that time. This is a very godless time in the Old Testament. The whole reign of, like the judges, this is not a great time for Israel's people relationship with God. So that may be worth bringing up as well. But anyway, like I said, we can see almost a direct analog to what's going on in our own country. We see people seeking to escape war, people is seeking to escape famine, crime, and all kinds of other issues. They come here seeking a better life, knowing full well the sacrifices and other obstacles they're going to face, as well as the hostility they might experience as foreigners upon their arrival. How much more would that be for Naomi's family, knowing that they are waltzing right into what is in essence enemy territory? But their situations are desperate, so they make the trek regardless for the sake of preserving their family. And that's worth noting. The opening story in the Book of Ruth is that of an immigrant family, a very important immigrant family, as we're going to see as we reach the climax and resolution of this story. The next thing that we read, okay, just past that, is that Elimelech dies, like Naomi's husband dies. And then after that, Naomi's sons find Moabite wives in Orpah and Ruth, the emerging protagonists. They dwell in the land for 10 years, and then the two sons die, leaving Naomi, Orpah, and Ruth all alone. Naomi, upon hearing that there was food back in her home country, she decides to return there. But she also decides she's going to tell her daughters-in-law, Ruth and Orpah, to stay in Moab, where they'll at least have some support of their families. And yeah, it would be the best thing for them. She tells them, in essence, I'm going to go back to my home country because, you know, that's what people do in times of trauma. I want to go to a place where I can find, you know, some sense of familiarity, some sense of home, and you guys should do the same. You guys are traumatized as well. Y'all should stay here. You should be with your families. You should get whatever support it is that you need. And that's when we move into the next part of this story. But before we get there, Derek, is there anything else you want to say about this particular part of the narrative, the tragedy?
Right. I think one of the ironies that's here in the Hebrew text is that the word Bethlehem means house of bread. So you start out with a famine in the house of bread, and then you end up, like you said, James, having to leave and go into a hostile place, traditionally an enemy of the people of Israel. And then you have Elimelech and his family being sojourners there. And that word, again, stranger or sojourner, is ger, which is also what Lot was in the city of Sodom. He was not a citizen of Sodom. He was one of these resident foreigners. And Lot ended up being the ancestor of the Moabites and the Ammonites through his daughters. But we're not going to get into that story. Yeah, that's all I have to say. And then James, I'll let you start out the next section talking about Ruth and Orpah's reaction to Naomi's departure.
Sounds good. Thank you, Derek. So next thing, like I said, Ruth and Orpah are told by Naomi to go back to, like, stay in Moab, stay with their families, handle some business there or whatever. But they both protest. There's something worth highlighting there real quick. Ruth and Orpah, again, these are Moabites, traditional enemies of Israel. Moabites serve other gods. The Israelites are often in trouble for mingling with the foreigners. So it is significant then that as Naomi is on her way from Moab to Judah, she tells these women to go back, not only to the house of their mothers, as we can see in verse 8, but also to their own people and to their own gods, which we read in Ruth 1:15. It's not easy, however, for these women to separate themselves from one another. The close friendship between Naomi and her daughters-in-law is obvious from the outset of the story, despite the differences in their backgrounds. While the link between the women revolves around the, 10-year marriages to Naomi's sons, they have obviously fared well together, as evident in Naomi's blessing. You can see that in 8 through 9, I believe. She says, "May the Lord deal kindly with you, as you have dealt with the dead and with me. The Lord grant that you may find a home, each of you, in the house of her husband. So you can see Naomi loves these women. Like, she loves them and she wants the best for them in this time of trauma. Like, even if it means she ends up alone and that they don't embrace the God of Israel. And I think we as saints, that's something worth considering, that when people are in the midst of their own trauma, even if we ourselves are in trauma, we encourage them to do what's best for themselves, even if that means that they can't be with us or that they can't perhaps worship with us. I think that has a lot of application, especially to those of us on the margins. But anyway, returning to the story, even though both Ruth and Orpah protest Naomi's request, eventually, and presumably reluctantly, Orpah returns to her mother's house and to her gods. And then it's not the same. It's not the same for Ruth. Ruth decides to stay and declares that she won't leave Naomi. And these, in here, we find the most often quoted verses in the book of Ruth. And it also gives us what seems to be the most popular lesson of Ruth. This is verses 16 and 17. Ruth said, "Entreat me not to leave thee, or to return from following after thee, for whither thou goest, I will go, and where thou lodgest, I will lodge. Thy people shall be my people, and thy God my God. Where thou diest, will I die, and there will I be buried. The Lord do so to me, and more also, if aught but death part thee and me." Ruth's loyalty, compassion, and her bravery, they're on full display here. And how profound her compassion is underscored by the fact that Ruth apparently had family she could have remained with in Moab, that she has no real obligation to Naomi, and that she's following Naomi into what is, in essence, enemy territory. She's an outsider at best, and she's an enemy at worst in Bethlehem. She knows nobody, and she has no guarantee of security. She's basically starting over in the name of love and loyalty to her mother-in-law. And I think there's a lot we can learn from that. Folks on the margins may feel like we're rolling the dice when we embrace the restored gospel. We love the restored gospel and we're loyal to it, but when we go to church, we may not feel like we're welcome, because generally speaking, the what's the word I'm looking for? The cultural space that we're in can be hostile or apathetic toward our identities, like Bethlehem would be to the likes of Ruth. We may not feel like we have a place or anything that the church can offer us on occasion. In fact, this is almost analogous to what Naomi tells Orpah and Ruth when they initially protest her direction to remain in Moab. Like, Naomi's basically like, I have no sons to give you, not even one in the womb for you to senselessly wait to be of age. And I can't do that because I'm too old to have kids. And I can't even do that because I have no husband and I'm too old to marry. So go home. Like, that's basically what Naomi says to Ruth. She's telling them that she has nothing for them and would prefer them to be in Moab, where they can at least have families they can be with. This dissuades Orpah, like that works on her, but it doesn't work on Ruth. And Ruth, knowing the risks, still cleaves to Naomi because she'd rather risk further destitution and cultural ostracization than leave Naomi alone. She feels like she can handle that, so she goes. And we know how her story ends, which is incredible, but we're not going to talk about that just yet. How much more shall we who are on the margins and have great loyalty and love for this restored church of Christ, how much more shall we be blessed for rolling the dice when we go to church, in spite of the possibility that we will struggle in a place that doesn't always feel welcome, in a place that doesn't always have answers for us. In saying this, I'm not saying that anyone who can't join us at church doesn't have enough love or loyalty for it. I'm not saying that at all. Even with a lot of love and loyalty, there are a lot of folks who just don't have the emotional stamina to be in such a volatile situation or environment, especially in a time of trauma. And I don't think the Lord condemns folks like that. Like, it doesn't appear that Orpah was punished for leaving Naomi. She made the culturally acceptable and understandable choice. What she did was normal. Like, all we know of her as she fades into anonymity is that she returns to her old gods, and all we can say or ask ourselves at the end of the day is, what if? Like, what if Orpah went with Naomi and Ruth? We don't know. We're never going to know. But this kind of speaks to the fact that we can be either Ruth or Orpah at different seasons of our lives, I imagine. Some of us have counted the cost of being a Ruth, and we're here. We are choosing to be here, despite the discomfort we have or may experience because of our loyalty to the gospel of Jesus Christ. And we've been sustained in the midst of that, perhaps even because of it. But others of us, or at different seasons of our lives, we might be Orpah, who are making sure that we have the support we need at a time of trauma. And I think that's okay too. I think that's all I have to say about these verses. Derek, do you have anything to add before we move on to chapter 2?
Yeah, let me just reinforce that Ruth and Orpah must have been very young, and they could have just easily gone back and found Moabite husbands and have children with Moabite men, and they would be all set, as people say in New England. They would be all set. But Naomi would not be all set. So that's the key to understanding and interpreting this. Ruth did this not for herself, but on Naomi's behalf. Like I said earlier, the position of a lone widow in the ancient Near East was very precarious. So we've got this act of grace and love when Ruth is able to leave behind her land, her people, her family, and even her gods to accompany Naomi. And this is a great example of a convert. And I'm a convert, and that's a longer story, but I just want to uplift the heroic nature of converts in our tradition. The other thing I want to lift up is how Ruth's actions making this covenant with Naomi are socially and culturally transgressive. So how do you know if something's socially transgressive? Here's the key. When you're interpreting an ancient text, you look at the other characters in the narrative and see their reaction, and that gives you a clue to what people at that time would have thought. Orpah and Naomi both agree that what Ruth is doing makes no sense. The normative thing would be to marry a Moabite woman. Even Naomi is acting, it would have been in her own self-interest to say, well, Ruth, just come along with me. But she didn't even do that. She was speaking against her own self-interest by telling Ruth to go back to Moab and stay there. That's what she should have done. But what she did is culturally transgressive. And I think that's what we queer people are in. I don't think, now some queer interpreters see a sexual relationship between Naomi and Ruth. I do not see the narrator as portraying that at all, based on the evidence I see. But I don't think you have to have sex between two women in order for this thing to be queer in some way, and in order for Ruth and Naomi to be our queer ancestors. Because they have a loving covenant. Like, I love how Ruth pledges to be with Naomi. That is a covenant. They name their own relationship, they affirm their own relationship, and they make a covenant between these two women. And in fact, this is the clearest and most intimate relationship between any two women anywhere in the Bible. So this needs to be named. I also want to name that up until this point, we haven't had any men speaking. We've only had the women characters interacting with each other, the three, Orpah, Ruth, and Naomi. And we'll get to that later. So I like how this story begins and ends with women's perspectives. And I love going back to verse 14. This is right when Orpah leaves. And it says, this is the New English translation, and they wept loudly. Then Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye, but Ruth clung tightly to her. Now the verb here in Hebrew is davak. This is the clinging tightly. And it's the same verb used of Adam cleaving to his wife in Genesis 2, verse 24. Therefore shall a man leave his father and his mother, and shall cleave unto his wife, and they shall be one flesh. So I love how this is the level at which Ruth is committed to Naomi. And when those haters say, well, the Bible says Adam and Eve, you can also say, well, the Bible says Ruth and Naomi. So just remember that, Ruth and Naomi. And I love this idea that you have, you start out with tragedy in Judah, and then you've got tragedy in Moab, followed by this act of loyalty on the part of Ruth. That is the sort of rising action in the narrative. And like I said, even though their relationship is legally unprecedented, we don't even have a word for what they were. They were mother-in-law and daughter-in-law, but that's once the husbands are dead, there's no more obligation. There's no relationship other than the one that they named and created themselves. And that's exactly what we queer people do. We name our own relationships, we create unprecedented relationships, and we affirm them. And later you'll see that Boaz actually invokes the Lord's blessing on their relationship. And that's how they can be our queer ancestors. So that's all I have for this section. Where are we going now? I think let's talk about the gleaning. James, I want to hear what you have to say about the gleaning in chapter 2 and their meeting.
I don't have too much to say about this, and except for this is the beginning of a parallel or pattern that we're going to see with regard to Ruth and Naomi making decisions together of what they're going to do to survive. And this should also give us an idea of what Naomi's life would have been like had she come back to Bethlehem on her own. She probably would have spent the rest of her life as, you know, a beggar on these streets out here in Bethlehem. But Naomi is going out and basically doing that, you know, for them both. But anyway, this is what happens. Naomi and Ruth, they make it back to Bethlehem. Naomi, a destitute and disgraced childless widow, and Ruth, a widowed, destitute, illegal immigrant, at least according to Jewish law. But news of Ruth's compassion makes it to Boaz as she gleans in his field, and that in turn inspires his compassion toward her. He makes sure that she is able to glean plenty of food. He has her work with the women of his household, and he instructed the young men not to harass her, not to assault her, as was wont to happen in those times. He's basically offering her, you know, a little bit of protection. Boaz's compassion makes sense for a lot of reasons, including the ones he outlines in chapter 2, verse 11. He cites Ruth's compassion primarily, how that she's taking care of a woman that she has no obligation to in a land that's unfamiliar to her, in a land that, you know, is far from her home when she didn't really have to. But there's something else that's interesting here that I thought was, I just learned it this morning actually, and I thought this was kind of interesting, something else that may have informed Boaz's compassion. And that's that his mother Rahab was a Canaanite sex worker who found faith and was spared in the destruction of Jericho. She also adopted a new culture. She adopted, you know, the Jewish culture, and she joined the people of Israel, like Ruth, and subsequently met Boaz's father. Basically, Ruth, the similarities that Ruth and his own mother share led Boaz's mother and father together. And yeah, subsequently, Boaz is present as a result of his mother, in essence, not necessarily being an immigrant, but being a stranger in a land or simply adopting a new culture that is not her own as a result of finding faith. But I just really like this this part of the story because it outlines two things. For one thing, it outlines the importance of compassion, the role of compassion in inspiring compassion in others, as we see Ruth doing for Boaz. The other thing actually occurred to me as a result of a show that Derek and I recorded last week, I think. Derek on the show, he talked about the necessity of preserving queer stories, not just for your spiritual descendants, but also those outside of the community who would need to understand their lives better, perhaps to be better ministers. Boaz had the means to be compassionate. He was a God-fearing man, and he was compassionate to Ruth, and he was a man that feared God. But perhaps in addition to Ruth's compassion, he may have been moved to act because of not just her compassion in a time of trauma, but also because of his mother's story, and which I'm sure he had been told many times growing up. So that was just something I pulled from that, was just this idea of making sure that your stories are preserved, especially in a community like the queer community where you don't have literal ancestors or descendants in that sense. You only have like spiritual ancestors, chosen family, spiritual descendants. And it's very important that those stories be kept so that not only your spiritual posterity can benefit from it, but also that their contemporaries would be able to learn compassion and learn understanding by reading their stories. I think that's all I wanted to share about that, Derek.
Yeah, you bring up a lot of good points, and it's in Matthew's genealogy in Matthew chapter 1 that identifies Boaz as the son of Rahab. You know, Rahab is one of the 5 women that are named in Matthew's genealogy of Jesus, and that's a longer conversation. But I really liked what James brought out is how it's the people on the margins that see farther, and it's the people on the margins that hold the center. I really love how all throughout the scriptures you've got people with various marginalized characteristics supporting God's work in the world from a different angle, from a different perspective. You're coming at this, and it allows God to come in and help advance God's will among the world. I'm going to go on, and so Boaz, like we said, allows Ruth to glean in his fields and take the grain back to Naomi and support the two of them. And this works for a time, but the two of them need a long range plan for what happens when the barley season is over and the wheat season is over. After that's over, they need to find a long range plan. And here's where Naomi and Ruth come together with a strategic plot. And I love how this is really relevant to the lives of queer people, because we have to work within these constraints. Until the constraints change, we have to survive the best we can and thrive the best we can. So Ruth and Naomi come up with a plot within the existing legislation, with the existing circumstances. What are they going to do? So now after Ruth has met Boaz, and they kind of like each other, they flirt with one another to some extent. This is reported back to Naomi, and Naomi says, aha, I've got a plan. This is how we can save both ourselves. And this is, I'll just go reading from the New English Translation Bible, starting in Ruth chapter 3. Let me just turn to that real quickly. So here's their plan. At that time, Naomi, her mother-in-law, said to her, my daughter, I must find a home for you so you will be secure. Now Boaz, with whose female servants you worked, is our close relative. Look, tonight he is winnowing barley at the threshing floor. So bathe yourself, rub on some perfumed oil, and get dressed up. Then go down to the threshing floor. But don't let the man know you're there until he finishes his meal. When he gets ready to go to sleep, take careful notice of the place where he lies down. Then go, uncover his legs, and lie down beside him. He will tell you what you should do. Ruth replied to Naomi, I will do everything you have told me to do. So here's their plot. They're going to seduce Boaz, get him to fulfill the function of being a kinsman redeemer like we have in the legislation. And that's how this marriage will provide sort of a workaround loophole for Naomi and Ruth and Boaz to have a chosen family together. Now let's talk about how this seduction works in practice. Ruth didn't actually follow Naomi's advice completely. She did the first part, because here's what Naomi said. Naomi said, just go there, and when he wakes up, he will tell you what to do. But instead, Ruth comes in and doesn't wait for Boaz to say anything, and to say what he wants to do. She actually proposes marriage. She says, look, I want you to be the kinsman redeemer. Let's do that. And then Boaz says, wait, we've got a little problem. And here's where the comedy comes in, okay? The little problem is there is a nearer relative. Elimelech has a nearer relative that's closer in line and first in line to marry Ruth and redeem the land that was sold. You know, Elimelech's ancestral property that Naomi must have sold in order to sustain herself, and now she wanted to redeem that and buy it back, but didn't have the money to do so. So now Boaz is going to be the one to redeem the land and to marry Ruth. Okay, so now what's happened? Now then they meet on the threshing floor. Now some people see this as a sexual act. That is, that they actually have sex. I don't think that that's what the narrator is trying to portray. It definitely is sort of suggestive, and it is sort of erotic in nature. but they do not actually consummate their relationship at this point in the text, from what I can tell, the evidence says. But it definitely is a highly charged erotic scene. In fact, the word for legs or feet is a euphemism for genitals in other places in the Hebrew Bible. So you've got all these facets of intimation and innuendo here. Okay. James, do you have anything to say on this? Or should I go on? Okay. So then I'm going to go on to chapter 4. And here's what we've got in chapter 4. We've got this nearer kinsman redeemer. He's referred to in Hebrew in the first verse of chapter 4 with the words Poloni Almoni, which means a so-and-so, or what's his name. His name isn't even mentioned. Boaz goes to him and says, hey, so-and-so, here's the situation. We need to redeem Elimelech's land. And then this other kinsman redeemer says, okay, I'll do it. And then Boaz says, well, there's this little asterisk, and when you acquire the land, you need to marry Ruth as well. And then the nearer relative says, nope, I'm not going to do it. And you're second in line, Boaz, I'll let you do this. And so the irony is you have an obligation to keep alive the family of Elimelech and his name. And this nearer relative, who we don't know his name is not preserved, and it's ironic that his name is not preserved when he was the one that was unwilling to preserve Elimelech's name and heritage. So I just think there's a lot of literary irony here in the text.
If I could real quick, Derek, just to lift
Yes.
that point up. The first thing that came to my mind as soon as I read this text was that sometimes even your own family doesn't have your back, and it's really unfortunate that, I don't know if Naomi knew that this near kinsman existed or if he was in fact in this town, but the fact that there was somebody ahead of Boaz and they refused, they shirked what would be their responsibility as a member of that family. That's a reality a lot of us might have to face, is the fact that in the midst of trying to live our own authentic lives, in the midst of us trying to redeem ourselves, the people that ought to have our backs the most would probably still shirk that responsibility.
Right, that is a really good point. But like I said, God is working behind the scenes, and for some reason, it's all for the best. It's just like a Shakespearean comedy. We want it to work out with Ruth and Boaz, right? We don't want it to work out with this nameless dude. We love Boaz's character. We as the readers have fallen in love with Ruth and Boaz and Naomi, and we want them to, we're led by the narrator, want them to get together. So that's exactly what happens. Ruth and Boaz marry. They end up living happily ever after. And they end up having a child. And this child is named Obed. And here's the thing. Then, let's see. Towards the middle of chapter 4, we actually have all of the men stop talking again. And it's just the women of the village. The women of the village give Obed the name. Let me just turn to chapter 4. Let's see what it says. So the village women say to Naomi, "May the Lord be praised because he has not left you with a guardian today. May he become famous in Israel. He will encourage you and provide for you when you are old." And this is talking about Obed, Ruth and Boaz's first son. He will encourage you and provide for you when you are old, for your daughter-in-law who loves you. Now this is being spoken to Naomi. Okay? For your daughter-in-law who loves you has given him birth. She, meaning Ruth, is better to you, meaning Naomi, than 7 sons. Naomi took the child and placed him on her lap. She became his caregiver. The neighbor women named him, saying, "A son has been born to Naomi." They named him Obed. Now he became the father of Jesse, David's father. Now I just love some really interesting ways the ironies are tied up. Notice that Ruth's love for Naomi is well known in the village. This here is the only place where the word love is mentioned in the whole book of Ruth, and it's Ruth's love for Naomi, not love between Boaz and Ruth. It says, what does it say? It says, For your daughter-in-law who loves you has given him birth. She is better to you than 7 sons. I love how this really topples this idea of biological family is better, right? It topples a whole bunch of assumptions. It also subverts the assumptions about males in society, because this one woman, a foreign woman, is worth more than 7 sons. And so here we have a chosen family coming out on top. And I love also how that Obed counts as a son to Naomi, and also in a sense a son to Mahlon. Mahlon is Ruth's dead husband, the son of Elimelech and Naomi. So Obed counts as a son of Mahlon, counts as a son of Elimelech, and counts as a son of Naomi. And when the village women do this, they redefine procreation. Procreation is about that which is life-giving. And Ruth's relationship to Naomi is what has been life-giving. And Ruth is a person who knows trauma. Notice that earlier in the we've got the tragedy in Moab, all of the deaths, and that's followed by a radical act of loyalty on the part of Ruth. Ruth makes this extra special, outside any norm covenant with Naomi. And then here you've got Boaz, in an act of radical loyalty on the part of Boaz, is followed by a great joy in Bethlehem. So you've got this whole U-shaped comedy structure. And then what I love in the end, you've got this genealogy of David, which I will read. Well, I won't read the whole thing, but basically Boaz was the father of Obed. Obed was the father of Jesse, and Jesse was the father of David. This is the King David. And this is the David that is the ancestor of the Messiah. And this is all traced out in Matthew chapter 1 and Luke chapter 3, their genealogies of Jesus. And what I want to draw from this is creativity and transgressive sexuality brings the Messiah. So that's kind of where most of what I have to say about Ruth. There are ways that Boaz reminds us of Christ, because Christ graciously saves us. We as the church are imaged as the bride of Christ. In some ways, this is like what Boaz did for Ruth. I love how they in the plot subverted the commandment against intermarriage with the Moabites. I love what this text teaches us about women's agency and women's voices. They exercise initiative and responsibility and agency. They don't let other people tell them what to do. It's the women who decide what to do. It's the women who decide to glean in Boaz's field. It's the women who decide to have this covenant. It's the women who decide to seduce Boaz. It's the women who end up naming the child and commenting on the relationship between Ruth and Naomi. And I love how God works through the ordinary. So when you are going throughout your life, you may get into some difficulty, but realize that God is blessing you in these everyday details behind the scenes. I think there's a lot of hope there for that. And this is really what queer people have to do, because they're making, Ruth and Naomi and Boaz are all making strategic choices within the constraints and laws of the time to make sure that things turn out for their benefit. And this is really similar to the tactics that queer people face when we have to live in a system that's not designed for us, whether that is our country or our church system or whatever. And I love how it all goes back to this idea of love and this commitment, loyalty, and that should teach us a lot about how we treat immigrants, refugees, outsiders, widows, poor people, women. And this is why I really like the story of Ruth. And the last thing I want to say right now is, I was wondering, why is this book named Ruth and not Boaz? Almost Ruth and Esther are the only 2 books of the Bible named after women. And in this case, it was named Ruth. It wasn't named Boaz. I really think Ruth is the central figure in the arc of this story. And what she does, her loyalty to a fellow woman is radical and subversive. And it's memorialized forever and ever, including in the story of Jesus, according to Matthew. So that's kind of where I wanted. Do you have anything, James, or should we move on to question and answer?
I think the latter is a great idea, Derek.
Okay, now let's open it up for question and answer.
You have some questions in the chat. Do you want me to read them to you?
Yeah, let us know what you see there. We'll go ahead and do the same and open the chat, see if there's any questions in here.
While you're looking at that, can I make a comment?
Sure, Phyllis.
Yes.
So today, because the way that they're doing it in our ward, if they asked me to give a talk right before this happened. So what they've been doing is having people write their talk and send it in. And one of the things that I've been thinking about as you have been speaking about Ruth and Naomi is something from my talk. And it says, kindness is the essence of celestial life. Kindness is how a Christ-like person treats others. Kindness should permeate all of our words, actions, at school, at work, at church, and especially in our homes. And then he talks about charity. It's the pure love of Christ. By kindness and pure knowledge. And he talks about how without charity we are nothing. And charity suffereth long. And charity is kind. And charity seeketh not her own. And is not puffed up. And those things made me think about Ruth and why she why she went with Naomi, because she wasn't seeking her own safety and her own security. She was seeking the love to love and show charity to Naomi. She was showing her the pure love of Christ in giving her this love and supporting her and forgetting herself and doing what was right. And we're told that if we do that, we have everything. And so Naomi knew that if she showed that charity to Ruth, she would have everything. Or the other way around. I'm mixing the girls up, sorry.
Okay.
All good. Thank you for sharing. So Derek, there seems to be a question in here about the prescription against Moabites marrying Jews in here. Like, basically the question seems to be, how was this prescription overcome such that the marriage of Ruth and Boaz was acceptable? To what extent was a principle of adoption applicable at the time? Can you say anything about that, Derek?
Yeah, there are a couple of things going on here. So what's likely is really what happened is that they just did something that was transgressive. They made an exception to the law, probably based on the fact that Ruth had joined Naomi's people. That's literally what she says, your people are my people. I think based on that, they were this kind of loophole. You know, see, queer people work in loopholes all the time, right? Based on this loophole, they were able to, and notice you have the entire village there supporting their marriage. This isn't something that they just did. They were married publicly, and they had the support of the elders of the village. I think later you get into rabbinic commentary, and later rabbis justified it by saying, oh, well, that text only applies to Moabite men. It's okay for a Jewish man to marry a Moabite woman. It's not okay for a Jewish woman to marry a Moabite man, and that's really what was prohibited. But I really think that this must have been, it still would have been edgy and transgressive, and in its sense, a little bit ambiguous in the margins, like legally, was it really permissible or not? And they just said, we're going to do it, and we're going to find a way. We're going to find a way. I think that's important. There's another question right here I want to quickly address. Do we know if Boaz was already married when he married Ruth? The way it's narrated doesn't give us the impression that he was already married. He could have been a widower. Now, he theoretically could have had another wife and been polygamous, but I don't think that's the point. I really think that given the absence of saying it either way, the reader is led by the narrator to assume that he doesn't have a current wife. And I know of no tradition that he was already married to a living wife at that time. Yes. Any other questions from anyone?
Looks clear. What do we do from here, Bryn? Oh, hold up. Somebody got a hand?
Yeah, this is Miranda. I was really interested in your interpretation of when Ruth and her mother-in-law left, and return to Jerusalem. And the idea that, I think, Derek, you said that she had an interest in keeping her daughter-in-law with her, but she was working against her interest in encouraging her daughter-in-law to return to her people. And I'm not a scholar. I've always come at this from the opposite perspective, that this mother-in-law was, taking inventory of her own situation and how really she wasn't sure how she was going to support herself, and she didn't want extra burden. And so I'm very open, and I just am curious, like, what leads to the interpretation that it was the opposite, that she wanted this daughter-in-law to come with her. I mean, it talks about them loving each other, which is part of it, I'm sure. Is there anything else there that leads to that?
I think, like, due to the patriarchal structure at the time, Naomi's in a real precarious position because she is not only old enough to get married again, she doesn't have any children. And I think Ruth is sort of her safety net because she is still young enough to get married, still young enough to have children. And I think, like, just to have a lone widow come back by herself would have been a little bit more problematic. I think having someone there with her, I don't know if that was what Naomi was plotting from the beginning, whether she had that as on her mind. But I really think that that's kind of what the narrator leads us to conclude because of what Naomi says so many times. She talks about her own inability to get married and have a kid, and how Ruth, I think she was trying to be fair to Ruth and say, look, Ruth, like, my life is all messed up. Ruth, at least you can have a good life. Just let me go and die, is kind of how and then Ruth is like saying, no, we love each other. I care about you. I'm going to stay with you, and we're going to work on this together because we're a chosen family. I think there's genuine affection for both sides. I don't think that Ruth, at least the way the narrator presents it, I don't think Ruth would have been extra weight or an extra burden. I think having Ruth there would have been, and as the narrator ends up unfolding for us, actually is a blessing for her. At least that's how I read it. Now, there may be some other people who read it another way, and that's totally fine too.
Thank you for explaining. Appreciate that. And I see what you're saying, that she was a help, even if she could do nothing other than help glean the fields for this elderly woman. That's
right.
going to be a benefit there. So, and I also love the chosen family aspect, that she, that Ruth stuck with Naomi and she didn't go back to her family. And I don't know what it was about her family. Obviously she was close with Naomi, but that relationship was better for her than going back to her father and mother and whatever. And we can only guess what that situation was. But so I like that emphasis. So thank you.
So Drew Crawford has a question here. Is the lineage that connects Ruth to King David a literary device, or is it authentic? Now that's really challenging, because looking at the historicity of anything in the Bible is really challenging because we don't have any corroborating sources outside the Bible. So you just kind of have to look at the internal consistency of the text and see what's going on. And one of the criteria used by scholars is this criterion of embarrassment. And if something is likely to be embarrassing, it's unlikely that someone would have just invented it out of, for no reason. And I think the fact that King David is portrayed as the great grandson of a Moabite is embarrassing. I don't think someone would have just made that up unless there were some authenticity behind it, unless there was some evidence or source behind it. It's not the type of thing that someone would just randomly made up in the era of glorifying King David to have, you've got this Moabite, the historical hostile people who are hostile to Israel, people whose intermarriage was banned by the Torah. Like, I just don't think someone would just say, I'm just going to make this up, and unless there was some kernel of truth behind it. Now, that's kind of, yeah, that's just where I'm going to leave it for there. So that's the only source we have for King David's ancestry. We don't have any other conflicting genealogy of King David that gives him some other, so that's what we have. And I think that's what I go with.
All right, does anybody have any other question or anything they want from Derek and James before we sign off? I really loved this discussion. I loved hearing a take on women, first of all, because we're like really silent in the scriptures often, right? Or overlooked or not taught. So thank you for that. Thank you all for participating, for your comments and questions. I really love reading what everybody's saying over in the chat. If you don't currently follow Beyond the Block, they didn't ask me to do this. I'm just doing it because I want them to stay around for a long time. Please, please follow them and leave them reviews that are positive so that they can get that momentum going. Lori Rodriguez is going to say our closing prayer, and then we will end until next week. Thank you all for being here.
Dear Heavenly Father, we thank Thee for the opportunity that we had to come together and discuss these stories together, and please help us to be able to be compassionate like Ruth, and to be able to be courageous and creative and inventive, and find ways to live that are healthy for us and our families, and that are compassionate, and help others to do so as well. And we say these things in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
Amen.
Amen. Bye, everyone.